Given that we've have a full room already and a full agenda, we thought we'd go ahead and get started, and those who are coming a little bit later can slip in the back. Glad to have you all here today. I'm Alan Hicken. I'm director of the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies. And on behalf of Dr. Christiane Castro and the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, who's co-sponsoring this event with us, we want to welcome you to this roundtable on the Philippines under President Duterte. We're joined today by 4 scholars from around the university who actively work on the Philippines. In addition to myself, we have Dr. Deirdre de la Cruz, who's Associate Professor in the Department of Asian Languages and Culture and also the Department of History. Dr. Alan Lumba, who's an Assistant Professor in the Department of History and a postdoctoral scholar in the Michigan Society of Fellows. And Dr. Victoria Reyes, who's a postdoctoral scholar and visiting fellow at the National Center for Institutional Diversity here at U of M. We've each agreed to try very hard to keep our remarks brief. No more than 10 minutes is what we've given ourselves a limit, which you know is quite a feat for any faculty member. We can't clear our throats in 10 minutes. After our remarks, we'll open up the floor to questions and discussions that Dr. Castro will moderate. And out of respect for the size of crowd we have today, and those who want to comment or have questions, we ask that you keep your questions succinct so we can get through as many as possible. We'll go in the following order. I'll start by giving a bit of background about the promises and the performance of Duterte since he took office. Dr. Lumba will talk about policing and its connection to neoliberalism in the Philippines. Dr. de la Cruz will talk about Duterte, the media, and the church. And then Dr. Reyes will talk about Duterte on the global stage. So I will kick us off. The last election, this is the picture that I took last April and May. I think it was April. It was still April when I took this picture. In the Philippines, this is Mindanao. This is in right outside Tagum City. And all over, particularly Mindanao, you saw these kinds of posters, right? This the figure of Duterte looming larger than life on the election. He had for a long time loomed larger than life in Mindanao, particularly in Davao City, where he'd been mayor. In fact, he's one of the country's longest-serving mayors. He'd been Davao City mayor for 7 terms in total. Now, there's 3-term limit in the Philippines, and so every time he hit the limit, he would have another office for 1 term. So he was vice mayor under his daughter for a term. He was congressman for a term. But for more than 22 years, he's been mayor of Davao City. So that's, if you got the map there, that's the southern, southeastern portion there of Davao, or of Mindanao. And for more than a year, he sort of toyed with this idea of running for president. It was sort of a year of will he, won't he, yeah, maybe I'm doing it, yeah, maybe I'm not. He had the national speaking tour and a listening tour where he was talking about federalism really as a way to gauge support for his presidential campaign. And he wasn't just being coy about whether he would or wouldn't. He seemed to be genuinely conflicted, according to those who know him well. And finally, he announced in December of 2015 that he made up his mind, I'm not going to run. I'm out of the race. And then people continue to work on him, and he waffles back and forth. And finally, in November, completely reverse course. Yes, I'm actually going to run now. Jumps in the race. And we get a very colorful, very unconventional campaign, although there's some certain parallels to a candidate here in this country. Most candidates watch their words really carefully. They try and downplay the unsavory aspects of their past or personal life. Not Duterte. If it was in his head, it came out of his mouth. So, lots of interesting and controversial quotes. When asked about his personal life, he, basically no secrets, right? I have a wife who's sick, and I have a second wife who's from Bulacan. I have 2 girlfriends. One's working as a cashier. The other works at a cosmetic store. The one working at the cosmetic store is younger. The other one's older, but she's more beautiful. On territorial disputes in the South China Sea, he said, I will ride a jet ski to the Spratlys while bringing the Philippine flag. I will plant the flag on the runway and tell the Chinese authorities, kill me. On a visit to Pope Francis, which caused traffic jams in Manila. I'm not sure how you could tell, but anyway, even bigger traffic jams than usual. He said, I wanted to call him Pope, son of a whore, go home, do not visit us again. His message, his style, struck a chord with many voters, particularly those who were upset and fed up with sort of politics as usual, the sort of Manila elite, and he wins the election quite handily. And most of his votes come from two areas of the country. So the dark yellow is Duterte. He got a lot of votes, obviously, from Mindanao, where he's lived for much of his adult life, and actually Metro Manila. He wins Metro Manila. Metro Manila is that blown up portion on the far right there. He wins every municipality in Metro Manila except for Makati. Makati is, of course, the bailiwick of the Binay clan, so he loses that. But everything else he wins, and most of them he wins quite handily. There's a belief by some that Duterte won by appealing to poorer voters, right? That was a group he connected with his sort of plain spoken language, and he sort of resonated with the crowd that were upset with Manila-centered politics. But if we look at the polling, this is actually a more complicated picture. This is a poll from Pulse Asia. I don't have a pointer here, but right over here, these are the 5 social classes in the Philippines, and you can see he wins the D and E classes, certainly, but his biggest support actually comes from the middle class and the upper class, ABCs, group ABCs. That's the group that supports him in the largest numbers. So in the remainder of the time I've got, I want to talk about the 3 questions. So he's been in the news since his election, mainly for his national anti-drug campaign, which has been accompanied by this explosion in extrajudicial killings, along with other violence. And so that brings 3 questions I just want to address today. How bad is the violence? How bad is the drug and crime problem this violence is supposed to be responding to? And how has the controversy affected Duterte's popularity? So first, just the numbers. The death toll as of this morning was a little over 7,000. These are people who've been killed since July 1st. 95% of those have been civilians. The other 5% are police officers, some government officials, including some mayors who turned themselves in, then mysteriously ended up dead. And the rest have been murdered by sort of outside police operations, is a euphemism that the press uses in the Philippines. But most of these have been kidnapped and then dumped in the street after they've been killed with signs labeling them as drug users, or killed in drive-by assassinations with 2 people in the back of a motorcycle, one driving, one with a gun. On average, we have 33 people per day who have been killed since Duterte took office. And I just want to emphasize, this is violence of historical proportions. This dwarfs what we saw, for example, even at the height of the Marcos years. The best data we have for the Marcos period places the total number of disappeared or killed between 1975 and 1985 at about 3,200. In the first 7 months of Duterte's presidency, we've doubled that number, more than doubled that number. If we break it down as in terms of the average number of extrajudicial killings per year, the order of magnitude difference is actually even starker. On average, there were nearly 300 victims per year during the Marcos years. On the current pace, if we continue the pace through the full first year, we'll have more than 12,000 extrajudicial killings. For the second question, how bad is the drug and crime problem that Duterte is responding to? On some levels, this seems disproportional. Well, on many levels, it seems disproportional. But in terms of the actual the actual numbers on drug crime or on drug usage, the numbers are notoriously difficult to measure. But most indications are that over the last 10, 15 years, that number's come down quite a bit. From about 6 to 7 million people in the mid-2000s to the last report just came out a few months ago. The estimates now are 1.8 million drug users, which is about 1 to 2% of the population. That's a slight increase from the last 2 surveys, but still, in terms of comparative terms, this is lower than it has been historically in the Philippines. The administration actually claims a higher number. They say 3 to 4 million people are drug users, but that's still lower than it has been historically. Now, that said, we do see an increase in crimes and activities related to drugs. There's more raids, there's been more police arrests, there's been more rehabs long before Duterte took power. Actually, since 2012, those things have spiked up. In general, and this is taking place, though, in an atmosphere of actually falling crime. By most measures, these are some indicators from Social Weather Service polling from the Philippines. Most measures of crime shows that crime has been falling overall over the last really 8 to 10 years. But fears related to crime and drugs have actually grown over that time period. So that green graph is particularly relevant. The green bar, those are people who feel worried about the too many drug addicts around in their neighborhoods. That number has spiked, has grown quite steadily over the last few years. At the same time, the public's dissatisfaction with the government's performance in terms of crime has actually cratered. So people are feeling less secure, and they're blaming the government for their inability to address those problems. So there was a public mood of fear, dissatisfaction, concern that Duterte took advantage of, and certainly helped inflame as part of his campaign. This is not coming out of nowhere. So how has the controversy affected Duterte's popularity? Just to wrap up, it really, until the last couple of days, hadn't really done any damage. And this is in part because this is basically what he campaigned on, right? This is what he promised to do. People knew what they were getting. This is what they voted for. They voted for the guy who had nicknames like the Punisher, Duterte Harry, right? This is the guy they voted for. He was known for his tough on crime approach, for his support of more than 1,000 extrajudicial killings in his own city, in the Davao Death Squad. He's bragged about killing criminals himself. He regularly says things in the campaign trail like this: "Kill them all when I become president. I'll order the police and the military to find these people and kill them. If I could convince you to stop, I'll have you. If I can't convince you to stop, I'll have you killed. If you're into drugs, I'm very sorry. I'll have to apologize to your family because you'll surely get killed. Forget the laws on human rights. If I make it to the presidential palace, I will do just what I did as mayor. You drug pushers, hold-up men, and do-nothings, you better go out because I'll kill you. I'll dump all of you in the Manila Bay and fatten all the fishes there." The response to his campaign has actually been overwhelming support, and he's doubled down. The day he comes into office, he tells the police, "Do your duty, and in the process you kill 1,000 persons because you're doing your duty, I'll protect you." He later says to the police as well, "If they pull out a gun, kill them. If they don't, kill them. Son of a whore, so it's over. Unless you lose your gun, I'll take care of you." After criticism abroad, he basically doubles down. He says Hitler massacred 3 million Jews. I'd be happy to do the same here. You can expect 20 or 30,000 more deaths. Personally, as I mentioned, he remains very popular. 61% net approval rating. And huge credit among the population for fighting crime. They see him as tougher on crime than any administration since the transition. Finally, just in about a minute, 30 seconds, let me talk about what's happened over the last couple of weeks. We've had recent developments that have forced the change in tactics by the administration, and that is the kidnapping and killing of South Korean businessman Ji Ju. On October 18th, police officers who were part of the anti-drug task force raided Ji's home, used a fake arrest warrant implicating him falsely in drug activities. They took him to Kamkrame, which is the police headquarters in Metro Manila, and they strangled him to death. And then a week later, they demanded and received a $100,000 ransom from his family. And this all comes to light about 2 weeks ago. And this was a disaster for the image of the police, for domestic critics. This is evidence of what everybody's been alleging, that the police are using this war on drugs as a cover to do illegal activities, revenge killings, extortion, etc. For foreigners who Duterte's been assiduously courting, this is an indication of weakening rule of law. And this was hugely embarrassing for Duterte. On last Thursday, he was forced to formally apologize to South Korea, forced to admit that PNP is, quote, corrupt to the core. And he says he's alleging right now that 40% of the police force is corrupt. And he's not happy about it. As this quote suggests, "Police, you sons of bitches, I won't let you get away with it. You will suffer. Maybe I can send your heads to South Korea." He then ordered last night the disbanding of all anti-drug units at all levels of the police force, and announced that he was going to take all the corrupt police and send them in and out to fight terrorists. And then earlier this morning, the National Police Chief, De La Rosa, announced an end to the anti-drug operations, while he focuses on internal cleaning of the police force, saying, "To all the road cops, beware, we no longer have a war on drug, we now have a war on scalawags." At the same time, just to wrap up, the war on drugs isn't going anywhere. Duterte's announced that he's going to form a new task force to carry out the anti-drug campaign under the direction of the Philippines DEA, and he's pledged that he'll extend the drug war to the last day of his term. In the past, he'd said it would end in March. So more to come on that, and I'll stop right there.
All right, so from one Alan to another. My name's Alan, by the way. That's why that joke works. And actually, it's a good segue because I am just primarily going to be talking about policing and specifically the drug war and what that opens up. I was going to start actually with sort of the longer colonial history of policing in the Philippines, how it comes out of basically a type of regime of pacification, of vigilante violence, in which law is being created on the spot as they go along in collaboration with U.S. Troops and officers, and how that extends into even the Cold War era, where it's again a type of increased privatization of policing, where it's all in the name of law and order, of national security, and in this sense, it expands into sort of this different figures, criminalized figures over time, especially from the 50s into the martial law era, which some of you might have lived through or actually have much more knowledge about than I do. So for now, though, I'll just leap to the present and just talk about how growing up in Pasay during the 1980s, and even after we moved to the United States, I always remembered how my parents, especially talking about, my parents always talked about how corrupt the police were, right? And how, obviously, the politicians as well. But the police especially invoked a lot of the type of the ire. So even as an adult, as I went to do research or did language institutions or embedded types of workshops like that. So everyone, friends, mentors, colleagues, just random people on the street, they all accepted that the Philippine police were corrupt, right? But in this sense, corruption was more of a nuisance, part of everyday life that meant that you can be pulled over for a traffic violation or had the wrong papers or the wrong license or license plate code. And so you would need to bribe the, the police officer to go on your way. So this was a nuisance, but easily dealt with through an exchange of money. So in this sense, everyone knew the police was corrupt. They created the law or interpreted the law in the way they wanted to as it was unfolding, as it was on the ground. And so they enforced the laws for profit, right? But this was understood as being just part of the system. It was small time. Nobody really got hurt except for the, of course, extremely poor and those who were relegated to ghettos in the Philippines. So after Duterte won, however, things, you could see a shift within this type of this ideology. So about 6 months ago, as Alan mentioned, Duterte created a new legal terrain through his so-called war on drugs. In this new legal framework, police and others, those who acted supposedly for the law, could interpret the law and in fact create new laws as they went along, improvising from door to door, saying they're going to search for drugs, go from neighborhood to neighborhood, stopping people on the street. So more often than not, there was the violation of rights in these kinds of quotidian search for drugs. But the biggest fallout was, of course, the pileup of bodies, right? So that was the biggest violation that people started to become worried about. So over 7,000 reported deaths, with about 2,300 reported to be police-induced deaths. So that means an overwhelming amount are extra, supposedly not, or under investigation, not formally part of actual police activities. And so these are vigilante groups or other things not reported as part of police procedures. So we need to look at this in two levels, right? So on one level, you have these murders by police done in the supposed act of self-defense. This is usually their argument, is that they feel that they're under threat. So a common logic that police use, not just in the Philippines, but all over the world, especially in the United States, that there's a sense of being threatened by these drug dealers or by the situation itself. So what we're left with is not a real sense, or not some transparent sense of what the conditions of these police interactions are. There's no real transparency as to whether these situations where the police are afraid for their lives was in fact not actually manufactured by the police, right? So in other words, not only could they be lying about feeling danger, but there's a real possibility that they created the situation of danger. Rather than attempting to apprehend a suspected drug dealer without harming or murdering the person, they instead manipulate the situation, acting spontaneously without no real surveillance or type of work, or mistiming an arrest in order to create the most type of violence in the situation. So in this sense, they've created a type of situation or condition where they supposedly have no alternative but to shoot, to kill, right? And so this is a funeral for an officer who was reportedly killed in the line of duty. So in this sense, it's memorialized as that. So on another level, you have the state policy level, right? You have this police level, but you have the state policy level. You have Duterte and the public leader of the Philippine National Police, the Director General, Ronald de la Rosa, also known as Bato or the Rock, have created a legal terrain that enables freedom in the interpretation and the deployment of law. In other words, it's a terrain in which vigilante lawmaking is not only possible, but encouraged. This is not a deviation from neoliberal policies. This is not some weird barbaric act, okay? This is instead part of the administration of these populations. It exaggerates certain dimensions in the existing structure of the government, in this case, the police. So to be clear, neoliberalism is, of course, it operates as if the capitalist market is the basis of human social and political relations. So to act in the market, it's free competition, which is to say freedom to do what you need to do in order to produce value. So as a consequence, competition and a type of quantified results, you want to get results that are easily, you can put a number to, are some of the most valued principles in this regime. So as a consequence, you have Duterte and Bato having a structure in which freedom and competition are allowed to flourish, to allow police and others to delve into the streets in order to accumulate results. And the most quantifiable and visceral result are the accumulation of dead bodies. As the market abstracts and alienates Filipino bodies into mere figures of a police quota, particularly the bodies of the poor and marginalized, then we have the kinds of deployment of what Achille Mbembe has referred to as necropolitics, or the power to, quote, define who matters and who does not, who is disposable and who is not. So here we have a historical situation made up of interlocking logics, neoliberalism and necropolitics, but there's still the kind of biopolitical assurances where the claims are embedded in the logic of biological life. As Duterte frequently says, in justification of the mass killings, and I'm paraphrasing here, the thousands that were killed pales in comparison to the millions of Filipinos that can be saved from the destruction of drugs. So this kind of biopolitical dimension is in Duterte's logic is articulated mainly through nationalism and the sovereignty of the nation state. It is a logic that justifies rampant extrajudicial and vigilante violence in the interest of national security and law and order. Moreover, to Duterte, the right to spectacularly kill vast swaths of the Philippine population expresses a kind of sovereign power that Filipino authorities are entitled to after centuries of colonial subjugation, right? This is an anti-colonial type of national sovereignty as he sees it. As he has said in interviews, the deaths of those not even suspected of being involved with drugs, they're just collateral damage. That's what he says, right? He uses the analogy of U.S. imperial power in the Middle East when innocent lives are taken from bombings because of bad intelligence. For instance, when the U.S. says they thought the buildings were vacant, they didn't realize people were there. Those are just collateral damage. So Duterte sees the same occurring in Philippine policing. For him, the attention by human rights groups and the United Nations is totally unfounded and hypocritical. For him, it is a question of post-colonial inequalities. If the U.S. government has the sovereign power to decide whose lives matter and whose lives don't, shouldn't the Philippine government, right? So here it is significant that Duterte invokes a kind of anti-imperial or anti-colonial nationalism in his disdain for the international community and in his justifications for the continued drug war killings. So we have Bayan here pointing out this hypocrisy. So as Alan mentioned, it's unfortunate that it would take the kidnapping and murder of one person, a non-Filipino, to actually put an end to the current institutional framework of the drug war. In the wake of the murder and cover-up of Ji Ik-ju, Duterte has promised, again through the threat of death, to purge the police of its culture of corruption. Reverting any blame on his own policy, he claimed, quote, "You policemen are the most corrupt. You are corrupt to the core. It's in your system." Although the war will continue, right, as Alan said, it is not exactly clear just how it will unfold. My fear is that with the dismantling of the official anti-drug units, the operations of the drug war on the ground will be even more flexible, right, and even less transparent, which is to say, an even more exaggerated regime of vigilante violence that can easily excuse the collateral damage through the figure of rogue cops, as he calls it, or the corruption of the police system itself. This, of course, will exacerbate contradictions and antagonisms within the Duterte regime, but nevertheless cause countless lives to be extinguished. All right, thanks.
Hello. There's one thing I just wanted to do here. So I'm Deirdre. Can you hear me? I'm Deirdre Dela Cruz. Alan asked that we keep these really brief, so I'm going to keep mine as brief as I can. I had wanted to start by talking about the relationship between Duterte. Is this on now? Sorry. Okay, now what happened to my thing? All right. So I only have a couple of slides. I took 5 to 10 minutes as being an excuse to wing it, basically. But I do have some thoughts. I had originally thought about talking around Duterte and the mass media and the social media, and especially the kind of new visual culture that's come about through the circulation of a lot of these photographs of violence. You'll note that I'm the third person out of a panel of 3 people speaking so far that have put this image up. This is probably one of the most iconic images that exists. It was one of the earlier incidences of killing. And it also, for someone trained and interested in the topics that I'm interested in, has a stark resemblance to the Pietà, which is basically the image of Mary holding the body of Christ. And one of the things that I thought to do was think about these images and the kinds of iconographic resonances that they share with other aspects of Filipino culture, and including Catholicism. But then certain things happen. The last few days have compelled me to really just stick to, especially given the short amount of time, stick to the relationship between Duterte and the Catholic Church and to the Catholic majority overall. The Philippines is about 80% Catholic, for those of you who weren't aware. There are 3 main things that I want to bring up vis-a-vis Duterte and the Church, or Duterte and Catholicism. As Alan had put up in one of the slides, he made a great impression by calling the Pope a son of a whore very early on. This, of course, brought very swift condemnation by the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines, which is really like the governing organization of the church in the Philippines. And that prompted, in the style that we've seen, those of us who've been following Duterte's ascendancy, that prompted this style of going back and forth, and he then very forcefully castigated the Catholic Church, saying that they were essentially corrupt and hypocrites, and this was his start with the church soon after he was basically elected. as recently as a couple days ago, he told members of the bishopric that he'll resign if they do. I mean, he's constantly going against the church, and it's partly, of course, because the church presents a body of opposition to him, but it's more complicated than that as well. So there are three main tensions that I think between his administration and the church. The first has to do with the church's long-held stances on these ostensibly moral issues like contraception and the death penalty. For those of you who aren't aware, there was a very controversial reproductive health bill that was kind of stuck in the judiciary of the Philippines for many years, that was finally signed into law by the former president Aquino in 2012, but that still had yet to be fully implemented. And just a couple days ago, anyone might have seen in the New York Times, Duterte essentially ordered or called for the immediate implementation of the different aspects of that law, which includes sex education in schools, that includes open access to contraception and family planning, and so on and so forth. So with that, of course, he has stoked the ire of the church again. So with this executive order that has demanded the full enforcement of the law, and that's something that he continues to clash with the church and with a kind of traditional Catholic majority about. The second major tension that we've seen over the course of his tenure so far has to do with the controversy around the burial of Ferdinand Marcos in November. There was a Supreme Court decision in November on the 8th to allow the burial of the former dictator in the Libingan ng Mga Bayani, or the National Hero Cemetery in Manila. Up until then, his body, or what's believed to be his body, was basically lying in the northern Philippines. And this was, with Duterte's blessing, so there were protests that erupted. The church took well advantage of this moment to, resurrect the specter of the former regime and resurrect the spirit of the People Power revolt. And it seemed like it could have been a moment where that kind of mobilization might have transferred onto an anti-Duterte kind of sentiment or action. Marcos was buried, and at least as far as I've seen, that whole issue has more or less died down. So that was another moment where Duterte clashed with the church, and I mean, especially the very visible leaders of the church, including the Archbishop Soc Villegas, who was the president of the CBCP and also essentially the spiritual inheritor of the Cardinal Jaime Sin. And the third issue, of course, has to do with the so-called drug wars. Church leadership on this was somewhat silent for the first few months, and then slowly during the fall, you had members, especially the most visible members like Villegas, like Cardinal Tagle, coming out and making more or less oblique references to the killings that were going on, some more forcefully than others. They seem to be much more vocal about Marcos's burial, for example, than they had been in the previous months. And this, again, we can, fairly speculate, has to do with the kinds of constituencies that had, in fact, voted for Duterte and were happy to have Duterte in office, at least for the first few months after he was elected. And then this happened, which I followed with great interest. So this was outside of the Baclaran Church, which is a very famous church in Manila. This was an exhibition of photographs, so I still end up getting to come back to thinking about imagery and photography and its relationship to religion. This is a very famous church during one of the most crowded events in the Filipino Catholic calendar, which is the period of Simbang Gabi. It's like a period of 9 nights of masses leading up to Christmas Mass. And so outside of the Baclaran Church, you had basically this quite stunning exhibition of photographs of the violence, including that one I don't know if you see, yeah, that one iconic one, which appears everywhere. And then other ones of people at wakes, of people on the street, and so forth. And so this seemed to signal, at least in some quarters of the church, more active and more assertive and obviously visible opposition, or at least commentary on the regime and on extrajudicial killings. I have a journalist friend who has just come back from the Philippines and who has been spending time there, in fact, with a lot of clergy members who have really put themselves on the front lines in the slums where a lot of these killings are happening. And so I think, just to wrap up, there are a couple of things that we can look towards regarding Duterte and his relationship with the Catholic Church and also with Catholics. And here I want to actually make a crude distinction between like the Catholic Church leadership, which continues to just engage, and which he very colorfully continues to engage at this rhetorical kind of lecture-y level, right, about how they're corrupt. And there's this whole diatribe that just appeared this morning where he's, talking about, the kinds of abuses that you've seen in the church as children, that he apparently claimed. So this clash with the leadership of the Catholic Church around the church's moral authority for the country, and then these other movements of possible radicalization of clergy and of lay people led by clergy on the ground. And I think that's something that you'll see perhaps more of. This friend of mine was saying that, there are members of particular religious orders that are working with lay people to organize victims' families, that are coalitioning with other denominational groups on the ground. And so that'll be really interesting to watch how those relationships all develop, and also how, the leadership of the church might end up assimilating or opposing, or, what happens to those clergy members whom we know in the history of the 20th century Philippines. The politicization and the radicalization of clergy is nothing new. So what will happen with that? And that's all I got for now. Thank you. Oh, there's also this, if you go to ABS-CBN, there's a video display of the posters outside the Baclaran, which is interesting.
Hi, I'm Victoria. I do not have slides, so I'll just put this up while I'm talking. So first, thanks. I'm really excited to be a part of this important panel with my esteemed colleagues. So in the past year or so, we've witnessed a wave of populism sweeping the West, from the UK vote to leave the European Union, the election of Trump, and the possible elections of right-wing populists in France and elsewhere. So too, we've seen this in the election of Duterte, who's known as Asia's Trump because of his similar approach and saying things that seemingly pop into his head without regard to implications. And since Duterte took office, he's made misogynistic remarks, mocked world leaders, sanctioned the threats and actual killings of political actors who dare critique him. He's also suggested that he may suspend the writ of habeas corpus, which would abolish the need for a warrant before arresting anyone, something that Marcos did before he declared martial law, though as Alan has showed, that the rate of killings under Duterte is surpassing those of Marcos. He also claims that Trump congratulated him on the success of his war against drugs. And this is all in addition to the mass extrajudicial killings that my colleagues have covered, and Duterte's own bragging of committing extrajudicial killings himself when he was a mayor. On the geopolitical stage, Duterte's rhetoric and actions seem to be a significant shift in international relations. He's cultivating ties with Russia and China, including arms and hardware sales, such as ships, from both nation states, and negotiations regarding the South China Sea Islands, once a source of conflict between the Philippines and China. Meanwhile, he called off the purchase of rifles from the U.S., just as the U.S. was debating whether or not to pull the sale because of the killings. And he constantly critiques both the U.S. and the U.S. military. So, for example, the board of a U.S. government foreign aid organization, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, recently said that it deferred a vote to reselect the Philippines for a $430 million aid grant because of the concern around the killings. In response, Duterte said, "I understand that we've been stricken out of the Millennium Challenge. Well, good. I welcome it. We can survive without American money. But you know, America, you might also be put on notice. Prepare to leave the Philippines. Prepare for the eventual repeal of the Visiting Forces Agreement, which is one of the current U.S.-Philippine military agreements." He urged U.S. troops to start packing. You know, tit for tat. If you can do this, so can we. It ain't a one-way traffic. Bye-bye, America. And in doing so, he threatens the 2014 Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, also known as the EDCA, with the U.S., which allows the U.S. military to have a quasi-permanent presence in the Philippines through quote-unquote agreed-upon locations, not military bases. I want to quickly cover two things. One, situating his anti-U.S. military rhetoric historically, and two, interrogating whether we are seeing a significant shift in international relations. So first, Duterte's anti-U.S. military rhetoric and claims of U.S. power and Philippine dependency are not new, as Alan had mentioned. It's a historical narrative about the relationship between the Philippines and the U.S. since U.S. colonialism. Nor is it a new rhetoric used by those in power. For instance, my research has shown how varied Filipinos have used anti-U.S. rhetoric and/or discourse about U.S. power and Philippine dependency in diplomatic exchanges, in the media, and the like, in a variety of ways to assert their rights in the face of perceived unequal U.S. treatment. For example, we see this in the discourse in the high-profile trials over U.S. service members who've committed violent crimes against Filipinas, such as the 2006 trial of Lance Corporal Daniel Smith of raping Filipina Nicole, and the 2014 trial of Joseph Pepperton of killing transgender Filipina Jennifer Loud. For example, Smith was arrested and held in U.S. custody before and during trial. Philippine officials sent an embassy note requesting Smith's custody. It was ignored. The U.S. Embassy then eventually responded to another note 2 months later, and they replied that they took into account the Philippine request, but decided that they would keep custody. The Philippines replied, "The Philippine government is seriously concerned over the patent disparity in the treatment of U.S. military personnel in other countries on the issue of custody in criminal cases." After Smith's transfer, Nicole's lawyer said that she would file criminal charges against the Foreign Affairs Secretary, the Justice Secretary, and all those responsible for Ms. Smith's transfer because they are all rapists. They raped our Constitution. They should all be held criminally liable. Furthermore, she argues that U.S. efforts over the transfer were arm-twisting the Philippine government, and that the Philippine president could be impeached for allowing this violation of our sovereignty and clear foreign intervention. Government officials also used this trial to condemn the U.S. For example, after Smith's conviction was overturned, Bayan Muna Representative Ocampo said that the appellate court's reversal is at bottom a major blow to our national sovereignty and dignity and to Philippine jurisdiction. Similar examples abound in the case of Jennifer Loud's murder and negotiations over the basing agreements, including the original 1947 military bases agreement, but also its amendments, among others. The second point I wanted to cover is, are we witnessing a significant shift in international relations or geopolitics? On one hand, what we're seeing is not new. As I've mentioned, anti-U.S. military rhetoric and claims of U.S. using its military and economic power to reproduce Philippine dependency has occurred previously. And Philippine government leaders have shifted their rhetoric across space, time, and context. For example, Cory Aquino helped topple Marcos, from power with anti-U.S. military rhetoric. But even before she was elected, she shifted her stance toward the bases and wanted to put the issue to a referendum to the people. She even led a rally in front of the Senate in favor of the bases and witnessed the signing of the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Security, which would have renewed the base's lease and which the Senate ultimately voted to not renew. Furthermore, Marcos himself was particularly adept at using the U.S. military for his own gain, saying one thing in private and another in public for Filipinos and Americans alike. So although he's remembered as a dictator and a puppet of the U.S., he was actually able to institute important changes to the military bases agreement, including a clause that changed the lease terms from 99 to 25 years and a shift of the bases from U.S. bases to Philippine bases overseen by a Philippine-based commander, asserting Philippine sovereignty over the area, though the U.S. would retain control over facilities and personnel. So is there anything new? Yes. One is the shift to cultivating Russian and Chinese ties. As a long-standing military, socioeconomic, and cultural ally of the U.S., this is something new. Duterte is seeking alternatives to U.S. money and power through Russia and China. What's also new is this public stage in which Duterte's rhetoric is being played out, particularly given the rise of social media, where each public comment can now be spread around the globe instantaneously. So will this affect U.S.-Philippine military and non-military relations? It continues to be unclear since Duterte has only been in power for 6 months, right? Over 7,000 people dead, and it's only been about 6 months since he took office. For example, despite Duterte's rhetoric of kicking out U.S. troops in the Philippines, and even this weekend, he warned the U.S. to not store weapons in local camps, the Philippine Defense Secretary also just said this past Thursday that the EDCA is still on, and that the United States will upgrade and build facilities on Philippine military bases this year. So the U.S. likely stance is to maintain a strong presence there because of the Philippines' strategic location. However, it remains unclear how the U.S. and Philippines can continue such a strong military relationship if Duterte continues to cultivate gifts and arms trade with Russia and China. Trump and his administration has ties, and alleged ties, to Russia and Putin, yet there's a backlash against those ties. And as we've seen this weekend, there's a general upheaval in the U.S. during Trump's first week in office. It's likely that in response to increased Philippine ties with Russia and China, the U.S. military strategy would change, but probably not drastically. For example, one avenue may be a continued U.S. military presence, but a switch in what type of military trainings to give to the Philippine Armed Forces and a more selective process in administering these trainings. Thank you.
I'd like to ask our panel now to assemble up at the front so that people are able to ask them questions. We're going to open the floor, but I'd like to reiterate Alan's point that if you could please ask a succinct question rather than make long commentary, it will allow more people to ask their questions and for our panelists to answer. The second is we are taping this session, and so if you could please hang on until Allison with the microphone brings it to you. You'll be recorded and your question will be better heard. You may ask questions of any of the panelists or open up to anyone who will answer, and we can start right now. Any questions, please?
This is a question for Alan. You mentioned the increasing popularity of Duterte with this sort of horrific human rights abuse record. Can you talk about that with the populace?
Over the first 7 months of his term, he started out high, and he's remained high. Since September, he's dropped about 4 percentage points in his overall popularity rating, which for a Philippine president is actually pretty good. So he remains just under Noynoy's sort of historic first sort of 2-year highs in terms of popularity. And if you get into the numbers about what people say they like and don't like, they like the toughness on crime. They like for some reason they view they report viewing his policies as being very pro-poor, although there hasn't been actually much policy-wise that's pro-poor. But that's what that was reported by respondents. The one area where he gets lower marks is, two areas. He gets lower marks for combating insurgency. That was one of the things he promised, and it's been very slow to get off the ground. And so he gets dinged for that. And he gets dinged on the formulations. The population is split. So there's lots who like the anti-U.S. rhetoric, but there are lots who are very deeply uncomfortable about the pro-Chinese rhetoric. And in fact, just before he took office, the Philippines had won a historic case against China over disputed territories in the South China Seas. And his first trip was to China, and it very quickly looked like he was giving back some of those hard-fought gains. And so that there's some division of opinion there, but not enough to really ding his overall numbers. So it is, we'll see if this latest incident begins to undermine some of that support. But despite the growing rhetoric by the Catholic bishops, the sort of constant criticism in the press, and both domestic and abroad, it really has not affected his overall support in the population. It looks, and that's the case across all the sort of class groups as well.
Thanks. My question, I think, is also for Alan, although any panelists welcome to answer. So the Philippines is generally considered a pretty competitive multi-party democracy. My question is, to what extent should we conceptualize this scale of extrajudicial killings and flaunting of both Filipino constitutional norms and international human rights as a form of democratic backsliding? How deep is the lack of potential judicial checks on this, and do you think it's likely to be a lasting negative effect on the quality of democracy in the Philippines?
Anybody else want to respond before I opine? The Philippines is a competitive democracy. I wouldn't say it's a competitive multi-party democracy because the parties are questionable. Duterte, when he it's a small point before I get to your big question. Duterte, when he ran, he adopted basically a all but moribund party, the PDP Laban, which had, I think, ended up with 3 members of Congress. Within 2 weeks, they had 93 members of Congress as everybody switched to Duterte's party to get in line. I think there's no question this is a mark against the Philippines in terms of rule of law, sort of justice and social justice and social justice norms. Although I think it's those concerns predate Duterte, right? This is sort of an extreme example of I think what many people have been concerned with over the last 2 decades, right? That the police, and the military operate with impunity. The courts can sometimes be activists, but are activists in selective and interesting ways. That power holders generally are not accountable. And ironically, that's part of what the population was responding to in the votes for Duterte, right? This was a rhetoric by somebody who said, I'm going to hold people accountable, right? I'm going to hold people accountable for corruption. I'm going to hold people accountable for not doing their jobs, and that was quite appealing to many Filipinos. But he may just burn the house down as he tries to save it. Other comments?
Duterte has threatened to impose martial law, and I was raised in that regime, so what is your reaction? Will he or will he not do it?
Anybody?
So the question is, will he or will he not? I'm not sure, and that's probably not the answer you're looking for. I think that Duterte has a very good handle on, very similar to Trump, on rhetoric, on saying things that kind of rile people up. Do I think he could? Yes. I also think that there are people in his cabinet who have restrained him, although others may know more about it, but that's what you see with kind of the U.S. military relations, right? Duterte is very anti-U.S. military, and yet we still have the Philippine Defense Secretary and others coming back, oh, well, no, the U.S. military is here. Oh, no, they're going to build and he's not going to repeal the EDCA, that sort of thing. So on one hand, I wouldn't be surprised either way. I don't think that's a very good answer, but.
So, I mean, just to comment on the rhetoric, right? He said conflicting things, right? He said, you know, no way would I declare martial law. That would be, you know, political suicide. But he's also, you know, said very recently, if you keep pushing me, I'll declare martial law. I took that comment in the context of the broader speech as just the usual bravado. Well, maybe he said it with some bravado in his voice. I don't know. I guess if I was going to lay money, I'd say I wouldn't expect it in the next little while. That would really shatter his coalition, right? Remember that one of the groups that are most supportive of Duterte is the political left in the Philippines. He has really close ties with the NPA, and that group would almost certainly desert him were he to declare martial law, and then certainly he'd lose the support of most of the ABC classes. Not all, but most of the ABC classes if he did that. So I would be surprised if he did it soon, but not completely surprised if he did it soon.
Yeah, I just read an article earlier today that was either today or yesterday, where then he framed, oh, if you as the Filipino people ask me to declare martial law, then I will, right? So then there's also, so on one hand I agree, but then 3 years from now or whatnot, there's this paving the way. I think that's what this rhetoric does, right? Is it's surprising, right? You can go either way, and on one hand keep hold of that coalition, but then also paving the way for Filipino people asking to declare martial law.
Yeah, and you can imagine a scenario where he says, I've been trying to clean the police forces for the last 2 years. They remain corrupt, and the only way to really get a hold of this problem is to take firm control and reform the Philippines from the inside out. I mean, that tack's been taken before in the Philippines, and he's certainly in a position to do that again if he chooses.
There was a question there, I think.
Okay, hello. My question is open for all. I'm from Indonesia, so there's a lot of comparison between Indonesia and the Philippines in terms of political and social situations. My first question is the effect of the XL coalition that he has. He has an extra large coalition. Will he dilute his stance over time, against the corruption in the police, for example, because we have seen that happening over and over again in Indonesia, for example. And my second question is about the political organization of the Catholics as now one of the biggest opposition against Duterte. So in Indonesia, there's actually really strong political organizations in the Muslims groups. So you cannot say anything against them, like we've seen in the blasphemy law, in the current election of the Jakarta governor and stuff like that. I'm quite surprised that Duterte actually get away with saying those things to the Catholic bishops, for example. Will there be political repercussions if the Catholics organize politically?
That's a really great question, and in terms of having ended my comments with suggesting that there are a couple different developments to keep track of what the leadership of the church says and how they continue to go head-to-head with Duterte, and then what the radicalized or potentially radicalization of clergy on the ground are doing. How those two are going to come together, I think, will partly inform an answer to your question. Right now, the CBCP is in a major plenary session, and they've been releasing all sorts of statements that are more assertively outspoken about, or statements against the death penalty, statements, and, against the lowering of the juvenile crime age. I mean, those are all really transparent lobs at some of Duterte's ideas and some of his policies. So the capacity of the church to organize, it's a little too early to see how that might work. On the one hand, it's surprising that he's able to say these things about the church. On the other hand, a lot, as everyone has said to a certain degree, a lot of the stuff that he says is surprising. So it seems to be part of the same kind of bravado rhetoric. I think what's interesting is the extent to which, and I think that this gets back to this question of martial law, and although I agree with Alan, you know, it's been done before, this is so different from what we saw during the Marcos period. And even when Duterte was elected, I was in the Philippines over the summer, and it was really perplexing the extent to which he was able to bring different coalitions of people together. I mean, you had the far left supporting him, you had like the far right supporting him, and you had like, you know, again, this ABC class. So for observers, I think we're still just trying to get a handle on, you know, what he, all the different pieces that have allowed him to garner all this kind of support. That's all a way of saying when he says that he's going to enforce the reproductive health law, all kinds of people are cheering in the Philippines, right? Academics, scientists. I mean, you know, there are people on the left, a lot of colleagues of mine in Philippine universities who were very outspokenly supportive of the RH bill, who are, you know, at least on this issue, will be very pleased to see this happen, right? So the different, I guess, I don't, you know, the different skeins of interests that he's bringing together and actualizing in different ways and offending in other ways, I think it's something that is really challenging to analyze. So it's not, it does seem outrageous, the kinds of things that he says, but his calling out the hypocrisy of the church and some of its corruption and, you know, their stances on contraception, I mean, these are things that, you know, a lot of progressive people in the Philippines have been themselves criticizing, so.
Could I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
Do you think there's any, for the critique of the Catholic Church, what role his own kind of confession of being abused by a Catholic priest, does that play a role in some of perhaps why there's maybe a barrier why the Catholic Church may not be able to organize if they're not? Or do you think that plays any kind of role?
Yeah, I mean, boy, I mean, he's the last person I'd want to analyze ever, in that sense, in the you know, in the Freudian sense. I'm not sure that does. I'm not sure about that. I just think that I think that the kinds of things he's saying and the action that he's willing to take on things like reproductive health are landing well among some sectors, and you know, what he's trying to do broadly, whether it's with this rhetoric or this confession or this executive order, is delegitimize the church as the primary moral authority in the Philippines. And so he's just taking a multi-pronged approach to it, right, including his own personal confession. So.
I'd say that, I mean, he's not working at the blank slate here, right? The church since the Fall of Estrada has been internally divided, right? In terms of their whether to play a social role. The public has been divided about their opinions of church activism.
Yeah.
There was divisions about whether, you know, the church's role on the reproductive health bill.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's you know, Arroyo stayed in power her full term in part because the Catholic bishops could never actually get organized enough to be one voice to call for her ouster. So that's one thing he has going for them for him in terms of you know, staying in office, is that it's not clear that they can overcome their sort of collective action problems enough to actually speak with one voice, and their moral authority's already eroded, I think, over the last 20 years.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
I don't know if I need this because I'm right here.
It's for the recording.
Yeah. I kind of have a two-part question. And it was, I think I read somewhere in the paper that out of the Asian ethnic groups, Filipino Americans were the ones that were most largely supportive of Trump's politics. And I was wondering how, as a similar caricature in international politics in Duterte, how that's playing into Trump's politics as well, for Filipinos in the diaspora. And I find it really interesting how his kind of like malformed anti-colonial view has in regards to the U.S. in particular and Western imperialism. But I also find it interesting that he's also enacting this nationwide war on crime, but also making an attempt to call out rogue cops as well, which is a really broad brush, which the previous administration, I believe, was very hesitant to do that.
Well, I mean, I think, yeah, this is great because a lot of the questions themselves that have been asked here kind of is helping me think about what it is that's striking about Duterte and this, war on drugs, for example, and then this sudden flip-flop on the police as being corrupt all the way through, and he has to purge the police too. I think I don't know. I think for reframing this on whether or not is he gonna, do as much damage as Marcos, it seems that he's already doing far worse than Marcos, and he's doing it quite legitimately. He's doing it within the realm of the rule of law as the world, is willing to recognize it. And I think the same thing is, and this type of rule of law is a common sense sensibility, in that I think everyone, even in the U.S., believes that he's acting within the rule of law, and the leader, the president at the moment, is acting within the rule of law and in the interests of the law. And at least from my sense, the supposed, you can find those analogies, like I think you were hinting towards them. Probably it's a leading question in terms of this idea of purging, or he says cleansing the police is the same as draining the swamp, right? In that sense, it's a very anti-establishment type of rhetoric, but it's a type of rhetoric that's, overcoated with violence. And it has to come through violence, not necessarily through progressive reform, but actual, I need to kill all these policemen, right? And so there's a sense that that's within the kind of common sense understanding of what the rule of law means. That it's not about sort of a constituency that creates, something that it's a type of contract or something, but instead it is about just deciding who lives and who dies. And that's sort of like what I think is a trans-Pacific phenomenon right now. So.
Sure. Well, it's almost to reiterate what Alan said, but using different words, is I don't think Duterte sees this as a conundrum or as in conflict with one another, right? So anti-colonialism is about foreigners. It's about Western, particularly the U.S., and stopping foreign intervention, whereas the war on crime is, I believe, probably to him, is effective sovereignty, right? He is doing what he promised he would do, which is kill the drug dealers, kill the poor people, whatnot. He didn't run on kill the poor people, but get rid of the drug dealers. And his rhetoric on kind of calling out corruption in the police is another way to blame individuals instead of the policies and institutionalized rules that he's enacted, right? So perhaps looking outside, it seems at odds, but I don't think Duterte sees it that way. There's one about keeping the foreigners out, and then being able to rule within.
Just a note on the support of overseas foreign workers for Duterte. I was looking to see if I could get, if Comlink had posted the most recent results. We've been waiting, and they haven't posted the final results yet. But in the so we don't know yet exactly what the percentages are, but in the pre-election surveys, the overseas Filipino workers were going really strongly for Leni Robredo, right? They voted overwhelmingly for her. But they found her running mate, Ma Rojas, highly uninspiring. And And a lot were supporting Duterte. Depending on the poll, he was first or second. It was split along several different candidates. But we'll see what the final results say. But there was a lot of support for, in certain quarters, Duterte, in part because people saw the system was broken. And Ma Rojas was the inheritor of that system. Binay was deeply involved. Grace Poe, had come from a former politician. So there was, in some ways, he was seen as an outsider, I think.
Hi. This question I've discussed with a couple of you before, but and it might follow up some of that last question too. There's one way that the seemingly abrupt shift towards focusing on cleaning out the scallywags in the police would make sense and could be seen as not such an abrupt shift, and that is with the, if you entertain the idea that possibly the entire thing has been, at least in part, about inter-bureaucratic rivalry in both in the law enforcement apparatus and also its paramilitary arms. This wasn't raised, but I'm just curious: has there been any increased evidence that particular criminals have been targeted, perhaps ones with certain allegiances to the police? Is Duterte trying to consolidate a particular base and eradicate another? And in this case, it would be perfectly consistent if now he's going after the police. Can we track which police are being targeted in the next weeks and months? Which may be easier to do than targeting which criminals, because those are much more shadowy.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to watch. I think it's too early to tell. Obviously the police purge just started. So a couple of just points on the inner sort of agency rivalries. So there's within police rivalries, of course. There's also police military rivalries, and Duterte certainly leaned much more strongly on the PNP than past presidents, and so that's been a source of some concern among in military circles. I guess there's been these lists drawn up of mayors and politicians that have been involved at local levels involved in drugs. Some of them, all of them professing their innocence. Most of them professing their innocence. Some of them turning themselves in and turning up dead. Others going to court to try and clear their names. I've not seen anybody yet who's actually tried to break that down in any systematic way to see if there are sort of patterns to how who appears on those lists and why, and how those get compiled. My non-sophisticated and sort of bird's eye view has been that this has been fairly disorganized and non-strategic from his point of view, right? That he has this program in mind, whatever it takes to get that program done, and that local actors have their own agendas and they may be acting very strategically, but there hasn't been anything systematic. But I say that just impressionistically. They haven't looked at the patterns to see if there are patterns. So it'd be interesting to look at who appears on those lists for the politicians, and then what parts of the police force are getting purged, and see if that reveals any sort of larger pattern. I'm not aware of anything though yet. That's a great question.
Okay, two external questions briefly. Has the Pope and the Vatican been instructing or advising the Philippine Church in any particular way? And second, quite different, is Duterte conceding the South China Sea to the PRC?
The first question, I'm not going to answer the second question. The first question is not to my knowledge, but that's, that's not saying much. just because so much can happen internally that is not made public by the CBCP. But no. Do you want to answer that second question?
Sure.
Yeah.
So the question was, is the Philippines conceding the South China Sea to the PRC? Was that your question? Well, sure, on his first trip, right, as Alan mentioned, right, he came back with tons of money. Mm-hmm. So, and as soon as he came back, there are a few things at play. One is not allowing the U.S. military to patrol, right? So part of the 2014 EDCA was enacted in order to kind of combat Chinese infringement, even though, right, there was this trial that declared Philippine sovereignty over the South China Sea. But part of the reason the U.S. military returned was to combat China's presence. And then after he came back, the U.S. military is no longer allowed to patrol. So I would say yes. I would say that he's cultivating those ties and he wants to remain that. And the South China Sea is such an important waterway to all parts of the world, right? That's why we have we did have an overseas military base there for so long, and we're continuing to cultivate a military quasi-permanent presence.
You're next.
So first, I'd just like to thank the panel for coming out and having this.
Thanks for coming.
And my question relates to journalism. And just for some context, I was recently talking to a colleague of mine about one of the more recent New York Times articles about it was a photojournalistic article about the deaths. I'm sure, you all are familiar with it. But my question relates because I was talking to my colleague and he said that articles outside the Philippines were sensational and they don't really portray the Philippines. So my question for you all is, what have been the effects of journalism on an international level and also on a domestic level within the Philippines?
I'll talk about that a little bit since it's something that I've been thinking about a lot. I don't remember who the journalist was with the New York Times one, but there was just one that came out too at the New York Review of Books, and James Fenton, I think is his name, and it's like one of a two-part series, and it's called Manila by Night. And all I have to say is that, and it's affirming in a lot of ways what you're saying about sensationalizing the violence. I think that's one of the things that is really hazardous about the proliferation and the production and the circulation of these kinds of images, is that while it does draw attention to what's happening in the Philippines, it also is, kind of titillating in a sensationalist sense. And the constant barrage of images and highly stylized images, I think, is what you see in the international journalistic circuits, at least according to what I've been looking at. Inside the Philippines, the journalism and the photojournalism in particular is far more stark. I think some of the images that, I don't know if it was you, maybe both Allens had put up were of Philippine newspapers or media outlets, and those are the ones where you see the victims, bearing signs, right? Like have they been labeled like pusher ako, like I'm a drug pusher. Early on, there were images that circulating in the Philippine press of victims who were bound and gagged, and it's a different quality of image that circulates. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily a more redemptory genre of imagery in terms of its power to critique the regime, or a more effective, I guess, genre of imagery in its power to critique the regime. But I definitely agree that there's a real ambivalent role that the media coverage of the killings in particular have had to play, both on the international and the national level, but especially on the national level.
Well, I think, I just want to add to what Deirdre said, that one of the reasons why you have this sensationalism is because the deaths are being situated as sort of spectacular killings. The fact that there are these signs, the fact that they're just laid out on the ground, this isn't something that they're trying to hide, right? And I think there's something to it. It is about sending a message. and letting that circulate through, you know, the new media world that everyone's been talking about.
Right.
And so I think domestically, there, at least from my millennial friends, this is like actually politicizing them, right? These people who are like usually just have bourgeois, you know, notions and sort of have a fondness of people power or whatever, have suddenly become sort of radicalized or actually looking at it every day, what's happening on the ground. And so even when there are these, you know, when there are these sort of small scale protests that happen, or there are violations of it, like, you know, like the Jeep or the truck that ran over, right? Those are things that elicits a type of outrage that I don't think I've seen from that type of group, you know, in the Philippines. And so this is ongoing with other types of struggles that's going on over, you know, land, over over the peasant movements that's been ongoing. And so it has taken away from that as well. So there are these things that I think once those connections are made between these longer running social justice and economic justice movements with sort of this critique of police killings, extrajudicial killings, I think that's like what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
Not whether or not martial law is going to happen, but rather whether the anti-martial law type of movement's going to happen, right? And so that's, I think, why we look so fondly towards sort of the 80s, is because they were making those connections at the time, the people on the ground. They were making it economic and sort of this extrajudicial killings, right? So that's, yeah, I think that's sort of why I think it's necessary not to just pay attention to the international imagery, I guess, but how that feeds back into what's going on the ground. So.
Well, my question actually kind of goes to like people on the ground in the Philippines, because my parents live right there right now, and I find my dad supports Duterte, and I'm finding it really hard to like debate him and kind of find this common ground, like just on the basis of like human rights. Just because I feel like there's that kind of utilitarian kind of view where this means to like a better end. Like he says that like the streets are cleaner. He's like feeling this impact. I just wanted to see if like you guys had any commentary about like maybe is there like a media alternative facts thing going on, fake news stories? I'm not really sure what's going on because like, I see parallels to like what's happening here. Just want to get your thoughts on that.
So, yeah, well, this was what I was going to say in kind of a different perspective from one that Alan mentioned, which I agree that there is this sense of radicalization of some segments, but I also have family there in Olongapo, and they are also, oh, no, Duterte, he's just killing the drug dealers. Like, it's not a problem. We're safe here. And there have been Philippine scholars who I've talked to at conferences who kind of also think about this media as sensational. And right, and this is someone who, you know, I didn't expect, right? Because you think someone who's going to US conferences and who is part of academia and et cetera would be perhaps anti-Duterte, but he was the same way. He said, oh, people are sensationalizing it, that's the difference between international and domestic at home. So I think this goes back to what Alan mentioned was his rise in popularity, right? And also what Deidre said about, well, he is doing this reproductive health bill, right? So I wonder if part of it is, right, these balancing of policies, right? There's killing, there's reproductive health, and this kind of coalition he's been able to somehow build and stay on.
Oh man, we were out of time. There's so much to just I guess two things. Historically, we know time and time again that when populations are faced with a choice between disorder and order and democracy, and disorder is threatened, they'll often choose order over democracy, and democracy is sort of viewed often as a luxury good. We take that if we can get it, but we want peace and security and order, and that's certainly some what he's playing on. But also, I think we want to. There's more systemic issues at play here. The reason that somebody like Duterte can arise in the Philippines and similar figures in places like Thailand or Indonesia, almost, is a sort of real political vacuum at the center, right? A lack of political organizations, a failure to turn the movements of the early mid '80s into sort of a coherent, ongoing political organization, the failure of, frankly, Aquino to invest in a political party over 6 years that would actually have some substance and some organizational coherence that could have perhaps prevented the rise of somebody like Duterte. So the sort of the institutional weaknesses I think in the Philippines both make Duterte more threatening and also help facilitate his rise and his continuance in power.
This has really been a fantastic panel. I'm so pleased at the confluence of scholars that we have here and also for those of you who came. Could we please thank our panel? And I'm sure that